Scott Howard here with you for the fourth in the series of podcasts of my new novel, 3 Days and 2 Nights, An Amusing Arthurian Adventure. The novel is being published by the Piedmont Journal of Poetry and Fiction. You can go to their website at www.piedmontjpf.com. That's piedmontjpf.com. The story is being published in serial online in monthly installments. Feel free to go online and read the hard copy, download the PDF. It's all free until July when the actual novel comes out in a book form, and then I'll encourage you to buy it. In any case, I'm trying to do some podcasts to get awareness up and get people excited about the novel. So far, we've podcast chapters 1 through 6, and today we'll be moving on to chapter 7. One footnote before I begin, the goal originally was to have these podcasts be about 30 minutes in length, but I've made the executive decision not to break a chapter up in the middle, so some of them will be a little longer and some of them will be a little shorter. Today's, I feel, is going to run just a little bit long. Having said that, quick recap. Last time on 3 Days and 2 Nights. It was one chapter, we read just chapter 6, but it was an important chapter because it brought our three protagonists together. Heather, running away from Malastaire's tower, encountered Aelfric and Scot, Scot the pagan swordsman who was introduced in the last chapter. They were having a confrontation/conversation underneath the oak tree where Scot had captured Aelfric, thinking that he was one of Arthur's knights and hoping to engage him in a duel. In any case, they instead got in a fight with the soldiers of the tower. Heather, running away from them, heard dogs in the distance, and Scot invited to take them to a place that he called Cathbad's Henge, Cathbad being his druid master. That's pretty much where we've left off, and I will continue reading in just a moment. 3 Days and 2 Nights, Chapter 7, Noon, Cathbad's Henge. "There it is," Scot said, gesturing to a clutch of dark trees settled on a low knob of a rocky hill that stuck up, green and gray, from the mottled purple and brown of the heath. A strong south wind gusted warm air across the plain, tossing clusters of heather. "What kind of trees are those?" Heather asked. "They seem awfully dark." "Holly," Scot answered. "They're hundreds of years old, and have living intelligence. I can almost feel them thinking when I'm walking through the stone circle and the wind whispers between the boughs. They gossip and groan and creak like old men. Cathbad claims that he can comprehend their conversation." The reddish clay path upon which they traveled, just visible on the hillside in the noontime light, wound up to the grove. As they followed it, a human form began to take shape against the trees, but much larger than a man. Aelfric halted. "Is that a giant?" Heather finished. "No," Scot answered, "though Gonoth did help to construct it. It's a wicker warrior for the ceremony." "Who's Gonoth?" Heather asked. "What ceremony?" Aelfric added. Scot chuckled and increased his pace, leaping over the rocks. He seemed tireless, and held long conversations without losing breath, while Heather and Aelfric found themselves sweating and exhausted despite the fact that they'd taken turns riding Taffy. He addressed Heather as she struggled to keep up. "Some would say that Gonoth is a giant, and some would call him a green man. He stands tall as a tree and is built like a bear. Cathbad calls him a warden of the forest, and says his fathers are these holly trees. His skin is green-grey, like their bark, and his hair is as dark and deep a shade as their boughs. His eyes even are red as holly berries. He's a good-looking for all that, too, well-proportioned like a man, not a monster. He's none too bright, though. He serves Cathbad, as do I." Aelfric and Heather exchanged looks, and he pulled up on Taffy's reins. The horse slowed. Scot looked over his shoulder and smiled condescendingly. "Oh, dinna worry. He's not perilous unless provoked or unless Cathbad orders him to violence. As for the ceremony," he continued, advancing up the path, "Cathbad had that wicker man built to celebrate the blue moon. I was to capture or kill one of Arthur's knights, and tomorrow we were to place him, alive or dead, in his full glory of arms and armour inside its chest cavity, and burn him. Cathbad's nearly blind, so to read the omens and make prayers he must have a bright blazing fire, and it must be at night." "You mean," Aelfric said. You plan to burn me inside that thing, living or dead? Well, yes, Scot admitted. Though you're clear of the cage now, seeing that you aren't one of Arthur's knights. That's barbaric, Heather said, wrinkling her nose. Oh, Scot replied. Remind me again what Arthur's law decreed for poor Guinevere after she slept with Launcelot. She was to be burned at the stake, Aelfric answered cheerfully. As I recall, though, that one didn't turn out as planned either. Scot smirked. Barbaric? He echoed. They passed under the faceless gaze of the wicker giant. Piled brush and dried grass surrounded it. The hollow of its empty chest was constructed of crisscrossed and lashed branches. It cast no shadow in the noontime sun. Somewhere near its wicker head, an autumn locust made a long, keening call. Scot led them toward the cluster of trees. They hadn't been able to see it before, but a ring of stone circled the hill under the shadow of the trees, about 2 feet tall and made from boulders of varying girth. Some were cobbled into a wall, while other, larger stones stood alone. Some were balls, some loaves, some flat, and some were hewn into great rectangles and carved with runes. Each trunk in the ancient holly grove had the width of a large millstone, with roots that entangled and entwined the rocks, snaking down and around them in all directions. Their boughs swayed and seemed to whisper with the wind. An old crow sat on a dead branch, its head nearly bald and faded from purple to white. Its eyes had once been yellow, but were so clouded with cataracts that the pupils had long since disappeared. A pet, Aelfric observed. There's no way that crippled thing could survive in the wild. Perhaps a familiar serving the druid, Heather suggested. You might want to watch your tongue. Caw! It shouted as they neared. Caw! 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 Then it dropped from its perch and fluttered into the grove. A gap in the stone wall loomed before them, dark green against the sunlight. Scot ducked under a holly limb and vanished. The wolfhound followed him without hesitation. Aelfric dismounted and draped Taffy's reins over a low-hanging branch. He patted the horse and whispered, Feel free to worry. If you hear me scream, I expect a rescue. In response, Taffy blew air out of his nose and lowered his head to the grass. Aelfric glanced at Heather. Should we enter? He asked. Well, we've come this far, she shrugged, and led him into the grove. When Aelfric ducked through the arch, he found worn and wobbly slate steps leading down another 4 feet into a bowl-shaped, shady hollow. The wall of stone sank much deeper inside than out. Spruce green moss and whitish lichen coated the stones and crawled up the trunks. Also, he noted that the wall was a large circle of stone about 30 yards in diameter, matching a circle of holly trees. He counted 12 in all. Dim green light filtered through the canopy of overhanging branches to illuminate a large pentagonal slab that rested in the center of the ring, obviously an altar of some kind. The place smelled of wet soil, decay, moss, and faintly of wood smoke. The ground was pebbled, mossy, and littered with broken and rotting twigs. A few strands of pale grass grew here or there, where the light broke through, though mainly in large clumps around the stone in the center. Caw! The crow called again, fluttering down from a branch to land on the altar. Aelfric noted that the branch, about the diameter of his fist, had been sliced clean off, the flat of the cut carved into a small, screaming human face. The scarred wood was gray and spiderwebbed with cracks and lines. The image disconcerted him, to say the least. Cathbad, Scot began, addressing the bird as it flapped to a stop. I have brought the strangers here against your wish, I know. Caw! Caw! The crow chastised. Aelfric and Heather exchanged another look as if to say, Great, he talks to birds. Scot continued, oblivious to their discomfort. It turns out that the villagers are wrong, and your vision would, seem to be mistaken as well. This man is Alanbart, a knight of Lord Gent of a place called Kent, not of Arthur's Round Table. The woman is named Heather and was fleeing from the rookery. She is clearly no friend of the tower. They didn't know where to go and were being pursued, so I brought... At that moment, the crow took wing, fluttered past Scot's head, and pecked at his face. He neither protested nor defended himself. Caw! The bird emptied its bowels into a sticky white splotch on Aelfric's shoulder. Why, you little son of a... Aelfric began, looking with scorn at his shoulder and then with hate at the bird. But even as he did so, it began to transform. Its wings elongated with each beat, the feathers taking the shape of knuckly arthritic fingers and hands. Its neck seemed to stretch obscenely. Its head expanded, bubbling out in all directions. and its color began to change from dark to bright. Neither flash, nor light, nor puff of smoke accompanied the change, just a strange, almost natural growth into the form of an ancient man, bowed by years. "Cathbad," Heather whispered. The druid was tall, but hunched, frail and thin, with papery skin hanging in waddle-like folds under his chin. He was covered in brownish liver spots, purple veins, and wrinkles. Long, unkempt hair sprouted from his temples under his bald crown. It wound thinly in uneven strands down past his shoulders. At one time it might have been black, but had faded to that odd blue-white that black-haired people tend to achieve in extreme age. An intricately braided and drooping mustache of the same hue graced his upper lip. Thick brass beads dangled from it, threaded through each woven end. He wore a robe that at one time may have been white, but had been dyed the color of sweat, and wear to a disquieting mottled creamish tan. Most striking, though, about him were his eyes. No hint of their original color remained. Gazing upon them felt to Aelfric like looking into milky water, the darkness of the pupils barely discernible beneath layers of age. It made Aelfric's eyes itch just to see them. Ancient as he might be, Cathbad was one of a handful of true druids remaining on the island, the last living disciple of Glenweird, the final high druid to be elected by the Great Synod. At one time, Cathbad had been a powerful and promising man, but years of bad luck, defeats, broken vows, unanswered prayers, and lost comrades had left him insular and bitter. He'd forgotten his promise to aid the people and use his powers to bring glory to the faith, and now lived wholly apart from civilization. He had few followers, no plan for the future, and dwindling abilities. The fact that he became a mere crow when transfigured illustrated this point. As you may or may not know, a druid's animal forms are directly linked to his magical prowess. A very powerful druid might take avian form as a condor, albatross, eagle, or even a great owl. An animal form as a bear, lion, or aurochs. Footnote: an aurochs, for those of you that don't know, is a massive wild oxen and the ancestor of all domesticated cattle. Regrettably, wealthy knights and lords hunted the aurochs to extinction for food, trophies, and sport. Nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing over 1.5 tons, warmed by a coat of shaggy black hair, and armed with a pair of deadly curving horns as widespread as a man's outstretched arms, it was truly the king of primeval European moors, heather, and scrubland. At one time, Cathbad could become a buzzard and a large fox, but now he could only assume the forms of a crow and a squirrel, both of these venerable and blind. Of course, none of his guests knew any of this, and because the knowledge troubled him, Cathbad kept it to himself. Before any of the visitors found their words, the old man spoke. "I am Cathbad," he said in a high-pitched, vacillating tone, tremulous with age, "the druid of the old ways, and this is my home." He gestured around him. "As you have been brought here by no fault of your own, I shall treat you as guests. You will eat my food and drink my tea. The law of hospitality will be enforced. Once you have done this, no harm will come to you from me, and none to me from you, else a deadly curse will be invoked on the offending party. Scot, bring us oatcake and tea." "Yes, Cathbad," Scot answered, and then ducked out the opposite side of the henge. This left Heather and Aelfric staring at Cathbad across the empty circle. Neither felt comfortable enough to converse. The old druid cleared his throat, as if to speak, but then did not. Aelfric diverted himself by examining the holly trees, noting that many more of the thick, low-hanging inner branches had been cut off, the amputated limbs carved into supremely emotional faces that seemed to snake out of the trees and stare disconcertingly into the circle. He fidgeted, avoiding their sightless gazes. When the silence became unbearably awkward, he spoke. "So, how do you like, druiding?" Aelfric regretted the question immediately. "It would please me, boy," Cathbad answered in an acid tone, "if you would hold your tongue until hospitality has been achieved." But then he continued talking quietly and absent-mindedly, as if having a discussion with himself. "Why does my warrior bring them here? And what does the villain of the tower want with this wench? Where is the great knight that I foresaw, and what am I to do about it all? There was a day when I was younger, and would not have suffered this lord of the tower to blight my land. That day is vanished into the night of the past, as if it never had been. Ah! Where's that boy?" He turned, seemingly staring through the gap in the trees to Scot's activity beyond. Aelfric turned his back to Cathbad and faced Heather. "You know he has a point," he whispered. "I've been meaning to ask. Why were those men after you?" "It's quite the narrative," she replied, "though I have a feeling that I'll be relating it soon enough. I escaped from his tower where I was a prisoner. I was not the only captive there, though. Malastair, the lord of that place, has imprisoned King Arthur." Aelfric inhaled a quick gasp at this news, and Cathbad swiveled nimbly around, smiling through crooked teeth. He began to dance a hideous jig on the spot. "Oh ho!" he shouted, rubbing papery hands together and cackling. "Cathbad may be old, and Cathbad may be blind, but Cathbad has ears, and hears many things. King Arthur, you say? Captured? Imprisoned? Glory to the gods! The omens were good for a reason, it seems. Very good for old Cathbad the Druid." Heather looked cross. "You gleefully celebrate a great man's ruin?" "Great he may be," Cathbad answered, "but terrible too to me and my kind. How many of us have his knights slain? How many henges toppled? How many groves put to the axe and torch? You mourn the loss of a benevolent lord, but I rejoice at the misfortune of a mortal foe." And at that he laughed a thin, wheezy laugh that ended in a croaking cough. Aelfric turned back to Heather. "What is your intent? You're planning something. Don't deny it." She said, "Of course I want to rescue him, but I don't have a plan, and I don't see how the thing can be accomplished. That place is a fortress full of fighting men, and he has a red wizard." Her eyes widened, and she recalled the conversation she overheard while under the bed. She touched Aelfric's arm. "Tomorrow is the blue moon. If we're going to rescue the king, it has to be before tomorrow. The wizard, Rabordath, is going to conjure a—" Just then Scot returned, carrying a dented copper tea kettle and a bronze tray stacked with 4 wooden cups and 4 thick discs of hearty cake. "Gonoth's outside," he said conversationally. "He said that men of the tower are scouring the countryside in groups of 5 and 6. Admittedly, though, he isn't much good at counting, so he might be wrong. He encountered 2 troops, but both fled from him. He wonders what is your command." Scot handed Cathbad the cup, filled it, then broke off a piece of oatcake for the druid. "I'll be with him presently," Cathbad replied. He accepted the cake and waited for Heather and Aelfric to be served. When they each had food, he raised the cake and drink above his head and said, rather sanctimoniously, "Let us eat together in the sight of these stones and trees, and bind us by the laws of hospitality." They ate. Both the tea and the cake pleased Aelfric. The tea tasted uncannily like summer grass. The cake, though dry, was made of a hearty oat paste, but savored of honey and was speckled with dried elderberries and little black seeds. When Cathbad finished a bite and sip, he returned the food to the platter and turned toward Heather. "You were telling your tale, I believe. Do continue." He opened his hands in an eager gesture. Heather described the capture of Arthur's party on the moors, unfolding details of the combat, the rise of the undead, and the arrival of the banshee. "That's a gale," Cathbad said, interrupting her. "A more dreadful demon cannot be found in these lands. I must give a thought tonight to her alliance with the tower. Continue." She described her capture by tower soldiers, her encounters with Malastair and Rabordath, and their plan to conjure a dragon on the day of the blue moon. "They need both Arthur's and a virgin's blood to complete the spell," she concluded. "They intend to use the dragon to burn Lower Britannia into submission, and then release the beast into the north so that it may decimate the crops and quell the rebellious locals." Scot's eyes lit at the mention of a dragon. He seemed excited at the prospect of combat with such a creature. To Cathbad he said, "Perhaps this is for the best. I beg you, allow the beast to be born, allow it to scourge the south. When it returns, I shall slay it, and we shall have peace." Cathbad smiled sadly and shook his head. His mustache swayed hypnotically. "I believe that you would fight valiantly, my brave warrior, but in the end you would die valiantly, wreathed in dragon fire. A dragon is beyond any of us. The old days are gone, and those with the strength of ancients are buried in the womb of earth. We are not now of the same stock, toil as we may to achieve feats of that kind. No, we may not let this evil be hatched. However, neither are we strong enough to take the tower alone, nor may we do so without the assistance of the gods, and without gathering a few important artifacts. Tonight we must have a sacrifice worthy of this endeavor." "Hold on! Wait just a damn minute," Aelfric interrupted, leveling a finger at the druid. "I ate your damn bread and I drank your damn tea, so you can't bloody well sacrifice me." Cathbad scoffed. "You? I mean to beg aid of the gods, not insult them. We will have the sacrifice for which we built the wicker giant. A knight of Arthur still lingers in this land. I have seen him in my sleep. My crows have glimpsed him from the wing." He turned to Scot. "Bring him to me." "But where is he, Cathbad?" Scot asked. "In my vision I saw him in a forest hunting. The trees were hemlock." "Most likely the Gloamwood, then," Scot replied. "Isn't but 2 leagues distant." "He has to be Sir Gawain," Heather added excitedly. "He was scouting ahead when we were attacked. It would be better by far to enlist his aid than to waste him in a pagan burning. I know him, and can get him to join us." Cathbad stood tall, inhaled, and said in a thrummingly resonant voice, "Better to have the aid of one mortal man than the aid of the gods? Girl, you don't know what you're saying." Heather didn't reply, but was clearly troubled and thinking deeply. Cathbad moved toward the far archway. "Come," he commanded. The noontime light hurt their eyes as they left the grove's shade. Cathbad's home abutted the henge wall, a small hut cut into the hill and roofed with living grass and moss. Smoke curled from a raised stone chimney into overhanging holly boughs. Casting a short shadow across the hovel, the giant, Gonoth, waited for them. He looked exactly as Scot described him, 18 feet tall, muscular, with green-gray skin, forest green hair, and ruby eyes. He leaned upon a thick tree-trunk cudgel, his muscular body proportioned like a man's, broad of shoulder, trim of waist, and attractive of face. He wore a simple woodsman's clothing, of brown-gray hue. A certain look of dullness or slowness around the eyes, and malice in the way he held his mouth, marred the perfection of his form. Though leaving both Aelfric and Heather uneasy, Cathbad asked, "You see my giant?" "Yes," Heather replied. "You wish to rescue your king?" "Yes." "Then choose. You may have the help of this Sir Gawain, or you may have the help of Cathbad and of the gods. I can cast spells. I own the allegiance of Gonoth and Scot. I can rally a tribe of 100 vicious goblins to our cause. I can call the creatures of the forest to my service. What can he do, this knight? Which of us stands you in better stead?" "It seems obvious to me," Alanbart said. "This same Sir Gawain killed my father, so I, for one, will be happy to be avenged, though I have no desire to watch him burn." At these words, Heather shot him a dangerous look. Ignoring her, he continued, "Although, in truth, I'd rather head north and wash my hands of this whole unfortunate business, as it doesn't really concern me." "Let us capture Sir Gawain," Heather interrupted. "Scot, I will go with you. Sir Gawain knows me, so maybe I can be of service in his capture. We can talk about what to do with him after he is our prisoner." Without waiting for an answer, she strode to Scot's side. Alanbart glanced at Gonoth. The giant smiled and flexed a bicep as big as a beer barrel. Goosebumps ran down Alanbart's spine. He recalled childhood tales of giants grinding bones for bread and drinking fermented blood from cups made of skulls. He shivered. "I'll come too," he volunteered hastily. "Maybe I can be of some help." And that's the end of Chapter 7. Here I thought we'd end up going long because I'd be able to do Chapters 7 and 8, but we're already at 23 minutes, so I guess I'm going to cut this one off now too. Again, my name is Scott Davis Howard. I'm the author of 3 Days and 2 Nights, an Amusing Arthurian Adventure. It's a story being published by the Piedmont Journal of Poetry and Fiction. The book is due out in July. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and my voices, such as they are, Jim Dale, I am not, but I'm having fun with it, and hopefully you're having fun listening, and you'll tune in again when I make my next podcast as time permits. Have a wonderful rest of your day.